First of all, thanks for, Nicole took off. Thanks for the invitation to come down. I always enjoy coming to this meeting. I feel like I end up taking away as much as I have to offer. And what better place to be than Ocean City in November? Kind of an ambitious topic to try and cover in 50 minutes, so I'm going to start right out of the gate and winnow it down. The secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, all critical for plant growth and development. Calcium, magnesium, really rare that we run into those issues so long as we're doing a good job of taking care of soil acidity with the right, with an appropriate source of limestone. Okay, we can talk about it more in the hall during the break if you guys want to talk more about any of the details on that or think it is something that deserves more attention. Sulfur, not long ago, we didn't have to worry much about because it came with the rainfall. We got plenty out of atmospheric deposition, but we all know that that's changed and we're seeing a lot more sulfur deficiencies out in the region. So we'll spend some time talking about that. I'm always careful about this because this next statement, but I feel pretty good about saying that in general, micronutrient deficiencies are not a real big problem in our region. We do have some situations where they pop up and are an issue, but they tend to be very specific, well-defined conditions, so we know where to anticipate them. And of all 8 micronutrients, the 3 that we most commonly see run short is boron, manganese, and zinc. So we're going to focus in on those and see if we can get all that done in now 45 minutes. So let's get started. Starting off with pretty high level. We can dive down into the details. I've kind of loaded this whole thing up with what I think are the most important nutrients and issues up front. So if we don't get to the ones at the end, that's okay. You guys, raise a hand and interrupt if you want to interject at any point. As far as micronutrients go, sulfur tends to, is the lowest concentration in plant tissue on average, about 0.2%. Even less than phosphorus. In some plants it'll run close to equal. And it's absorbed as an anion at -2 sulfate anion. Important in the formation of a number of amino acids and therefore important for protein, contained in methionine and cysteine. So it's really important for animal nutrition. We see this pop up a lot. It's also, because of its role in formation of proteins, really important for nitrogen use efficiency as well as grain quality. That's something else to keep in mind. The other one is that it serves a critical role in the production of chlorophyll, and that provides us a good clue in terms of identifying deficiency symptoms in the growing plant. Alfalfa is probably the crop that we'll see deficiencies first in a soil that's running short, but we also see it in members of the mustard family, the cole crops, cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, as well as anything in the onion family, onions and garlic, etc. So deficiency symptoms, because of its role in chlorophyll production, as well as protein, look a lot like nitrogen deficiency. Stunted plants, overall yellow color. The way you can distinguish it, though, is that with nitrogen, the deficiency symptoms show up in the older leaves. And with sulfur, it's not as easily translocated from the older leaves to the newer leaves, so deficiency symptoms tend to show up either over the whole plant or just in the new growth, depending on which crop we're looking at and its growth stage and development. So relatively easy, especially later in the season where you can distinguish the two. Early in the season, from my eyes, they almost look identical, a sulfur or nitrogen deficiency. And there you got to start asking questions, how much nitrogen do we have up front? What are the soil types? What's the history of the field? And then going in and doing some additional diagnostic testing we'll talk about. So in soil, we have a small amount of sulfur tied up in soil minerals, including gypsum and pyrite in some environments. We do get some absorption onto iron aluminum oxides, especially in subsoils. We have a little bit of clay. But the vast majority of sulfur is in organic matter, just like nitrogen. On somewhere in the 75 to 95% of the total sulfur in soil is in organic matter. The other thing in thinking about the behavior of sulfur in soil, it's somewhere in between what we think of with nitrogen. It's mobile, but not as mobile as nitrogen. But with phosphorus, it doesn't adsorb onto those iron aluminum oxides as tight. So leaching potential not as high as sulfur, and not as high as nitrogen, and as you'd expect, where deficiencies tend to show up are in those coarse textured soils, especially where we've got that low organic matter. So less storage capacity, and the sulfate anion is more likely to leach. So as I said right out of the gate, it wasn't that long ago we didn't really have to worry much about sulfur. I remember as an undergraduate, in the late 90s when I took my first soil fertility class, the professor talked about we get plenty of sulfur directly from the atmosphere, and even if they were to cut all that off, we've still got 50 years worth stored in our soils. This is in Texas, much heavier soils, much higher organic matter. And then I got to Virginia Tech where I did my graduate work, and we started looking at actually deposition rates and these sandier coastal plain soils, especially when we get out onto the lower coastal plain. And projections were there that we're going to start to see sulfur run short in a lot of these fields pretty quick. It still took a while, and I'm going to show you some figures. We can look at why. So this is the Clean Air Act. The amendment to the Clean Air Act passed in 1990. This is sulfur deposition, kilograms per hectare. Let's call it pounds per acre. That's sulfate. We divide that by 3. That works out to be sulfur. And we can approximate pounds per acre. And these red zones here, so that's in excess of about 8 pounds of elemental sulfur per acre per year. 1985, you see that basically everything in the eastern half of the United States is bold red. 1990, the amendment to the Clean Air Act passed, still bold red. Just 5 years later, you can already see the impact of that. The scrubbers did a really good job of pulling that sulfur out of the stacks. By 2000, still a little bit of red. By 2005, you see it fading, and here it is in 2000. Still a little bit of yellow in here, so we're still somewhere in this 8 to 12 kilograms of sulfate per hectare. When we get the most recent data I could find, 2016, that map's almost green. We're not getting much sulfur out of the atmosphere anymore. These red zones, I mean, that's pretty close to crop removal. On even our most demanding crops, for most of our grain crops, it exceeds it by as much as 2 or 3-fold. So plenty of sulfur from the atmosphere in those days, and here we're not getting any more of that. So no duh, we're starting to run into issues with sulfur. We're also seeing this in soil test values. We've been looking at measuring Mehlich-3 sulfur in every sample that comes into the lab at Penn State since the early 2000s. What I'm showing here is just the median Mehlich-3 sulfur value just for agronomic crops, just so we can kind of hold that constant and look over time. Back in 2004 through, all the way through 2008, 2009, we're hovering somewhere up around 20 part per million, and then you see just as we get past that, it falls off a cliff. And now today we're somewhere, last time I summarized it, we're getting pretty close to about 10 parts per million. So dramatic shift, and it's sort of the logical result of what you'd expect from the reduction in atmospheric deposition. So I guess this is a good point to pose the question, can we use soil testing to predict sulfur need? And I'll put that out there for you guys, and then I'll let you know what I think. Anybody? One brave soul? Yes or no? Yes. I got a yes. Anybody contradict that? The general consensus is no. Soil testing is really not that useful a measure of the soil's ability to provide sufficient levels of sulfur. And the big reason of that is because, just like nitrogen, that sulfur cycle is really dynamic. Most of the sulfur is locked up in organic matter, and the plant available forms are easy to leach. So we do have a couple of methods that in certain situations have shown to be reasonably accurate at predicting sulfur need. This monobasic calcium phosphate, who's ever heard of that test? It's not one that's routinely offered by most labs. We don't offer it. We do it for researchers, but it's not something that you would ever see on our menu of services. Most of us use Mehlich 3 or something similar, and we do measure sulfur, and our general guidelines suggest that we should really be using this as simply a means to track sulfur over time, kind of like we were looking at that figure before, and just to kind of see where your field falls out versus everybody else's. Are you kind of in that normal range? All right, so that's the general consensus, and that's the knowledge that I had up until about 6 weeks ago when I summarized this data. So in 2015, 16, and 17, Doug Beagle and I worked on and put together 27 site years of sulfur response trials in the state. We knew that sulfur was becoming a bigger issue. We wanted to make sure we had our arms wrapped around it. So working with a bunch of folks in the state, we put these trials out. 20% of the locations, we found a significant positive response to sulfur addition. So 20% of sites, we're seeing a significant response to sulfur. Of course, one of the things we wanted to do is define that, figure out how widespread sulfur deficiencies are. But the other one is let's look at some of these diagnostic tools, including soil testing and plant tissue testing. I'm already burying the lead a little bit, but we looked at a total of 5 different extraction methods to evaluate sulfur, including the normal monobasic calcium phosphate that we were looking at. But we also looked at our tried and true Mehlich 3 that we run on every sample that comes into the lab. And as it turns out, we were actually able to distinguish responsive from non-responsive sites. The red points here are all the responsive locations, and we're able to find a nice separation. So this is in the 0 to 6 inch sampling depth. We also took deeper samples down to 12 inches. A slight improvement by sampling a little bit deeper. Sulfate ion's mobile, so we're able to pick up a little bit more and distinguish those a little better, but only marginal, not that much better. So it does show promise. I think that we should all look at this with a healthy dose of skepticism, because it contradicts most what everybody else has found. But I still think that Mehlich 3 is a good measure, at least to evaluate how things are going over time. And if it were me managing this and we were falling down below 15 part per million, that's the field I'd put sulfur on first. And maybe that's the safest way to approach that one. We also have a really good measure of sulfur sufficiency, and that's using plant tissue analysis. Reasonably well-defined sufficiency ranges for all of our important agronomic crops and most of our vegetables. The thing to keep in mind with all of these, and you guys have heard this before, when we're trying to compare our tissue sample results to lookup tables, it's really important that we've collected that sample at the right time, the right growth stage, and from the right part. All of these numbers are based on a very specific time and part, and we know that they change over the growing season. So in terms of managing sulfur, I think when we're thinking about application rates, I always like to benchmark that against what we expect crop removal to be. For most of our grain crops, we're not going to see removal much more than about 5 to 15 pounds per acre per year. Forage crops, a little higher, more biomass, especially if we're looking at a high protein forage like alfalfa, we're more in the range of 30 pounds per acre per year. So when we do expect to see a response for grain crops, 15 to 25 pounds per acre is generally thought to meet the need. Adjusting that rate based on the soil levels and expected yields. Forage crops, of course, we want to put a little bit more to make sure that we're both replacing what's being removed as well as we know that some of that sulfur we're going to put down is potentially going to leach, so we want to make sure that we cover that as well. As far as fertilizers, lots of different options. Ammonium sulfate, it's 24% sulfur. Really great starter. Put 100 pounds down with the starter in a 2x2, and you've taken care of the sulfur needs for even the best corn crop. Gypsum. Gypsum's now much more widely available. We pulled it out of the stacks. We've got lots of flue gas desulfurization gypsum. So now we pull it out of the air, make big mountains of it, and then sell it to us. That's a pretty good deal. Ammonium thiosulfate, Works really well with UAN solutions, etc. The other thing to always keep in mind is that manure is a really good source of sulfur. And any place where we've got a manure addition happening, we can feel pretty good that soil's got plenty of sulfur built up in it. All right, shifting gears now to micronutrients. Again, with micronutrient deficiencies being relatively rare in the region, which is fortunate, we do know pretty well where to expect them. Pretty narrow set of well-defined conditions. And again, focusing on boron, manganese, and zinc. In general, the issue is not so much the soil supply, it's its availability. And to illustrate that, we can look at typical crop removal from a pretty good corn yield, 200 bushels to the acre, relative to the types of concentrations we expect to find in the surface 6 inches of an agricultural soil. And you do the math really quick, even for the most limiting nutrient there, we're looking at like a 200-year plus supply. There's plenty there. It's not a matter of having the supply, it's how soluble or plant available it is. So we got to recognize the conditions that limit solubility or availability. So just gross overview, those specific well-defined conditions. pH is probably the most important factor. The higher the pH, the less soluble most of those micronutrients are. Molybdenum is the exception to that, and molybdenum is just an odd duck. Low organic matter, low CEC. We're not holding on to those nutrients, and maybe they've leached lower in the profile, and of course, coarse textured soils. We also see with some of the micronutrients, manganese, for example, tend to be more prone to deficiencies in these muck soils, really high organic matter. So both low organic matter is an issue, really high organic matter is also an issue, and unmanured soils. For most of the micronutrients, manure is a great source of micronutrients. And where we've separated animals from agriculture, that's where we are more likely to start seeing those deficiencies. So I'm not going to dwell on this long. You guys have all seen this type of figure many, many times. It's just really critical to think about. When we're managing soil acidity, we want to get things up close to 6 or 6.5 to maximize availability of all of our macronutrients, but we want to be really careful not to get it up above 7, 7.2. And even some of our soils, we can start running into micronutrient deficiencies when we exceed 6.5. And it seems to be even more so when we go south and or where we get into those muck soils. With micronutrient deficiency, though, the critical thing is we've got to manage that soil acidity carefully. Not too high, not too low. All right, so dial in a little bit on boron. Plant available form, all boric acid, soluble, very soluble form. Average plant tissue concentration across all plants, they're about 20 parts per million, so just a tiny little bit. Its role in plant nutrition, it's essential for protein synthesis, seed and cell wall formation, as well as in corn. It's got a critical role in those pollen tube and growth of those pollen tubes. So again, looking at that as a key indicator of or a clue as to what deficiency symptoms might look like. Really easy to see in alfalfa, we end up with this breakdown of that growing tip, so shortening of the internodes. You end up with what they call this rosetting. It looks like that the whole stem has just been squished on top of itself, so you've got all those leaves branching out from one point. We often see this reddish color developing around the edges. It can fool you, and this has gotten me a bunch of times. It does look a lot like leaf hopper damage, or leaf hopper damage looks a lot like boron deficiency, however you want to look at it. So got to take a closer look. It's not one that you can scout from the bench of your pickup truck. And in our region, deficiencies, most commonly seen in alfalfa. We also see it show up in the cold crops again, cauliflower, broccoli, and cabbage. That's where you do your best work, isn't it? Conditions favorable for deficiency. This is a really common one. This alfalfa yellows is drought-induced boron deficiency. where and I've been fooled by this one before. You go out and you see, that yellow patching all over the field. First verify it's not leafhopper damage. And you get all excited. I'm going to go back and come over the top with some boron, and it rains before you get back out there, and that boron deficiency just disappears in 24, 48 hours. Where some of that soluble boron deeper down in the profile or up close to the soil surface all of a sudden became available that wasn't there before. The other one, and this gets a little bit tricky. We're trying to manage that alfalfa stand, that soil, somewhere 6.5 and 7. We want to optimize the conditions for the rhizobia bacteria, create the good hospitable environment. The challenge is that we get much over 7 and boron solubility just falls off a cliff. So we're running right along that knife's edge just trying to keep the pH up. And where you'll often see it is, if we don't have a uniform application, you got some overlap in the line spreader, and or you've got some pockets in the field that maybe a little bit sandier, lower buffering capacity, we end up over liming those. That's where you start running into problems with this. Low organic matter is a really important source, and again with those coarse textured soils, is that plant available form of boron is easily leached. We know that crops differ in their sensitivity to boron deficiency. Alfalfa right there on the at the top of the list on the highly sensitive. Most of your coal crops. Apple, I was actually surprised to see Robertson et al. Actually define this one as moderately sensitive. I've always thought about it as being more sensitive. And then asparagus and others over here on the low sensitivity. So now thinking about diagnosing, how do we identify where boron deficiencies show up? Soil testing in general has never been seen as an especially reliable means of predicting boron deficiency. In places where it's shown marginal promise, it's the hot water extractable boron. We do offer that one. It's not one in our standard suite of assays. It's you got to call the lab and ask for a special request. It's not something that you're going to see routinely used. Malic 3 boron is often included in Malic 3 results. We don't do it, and we don't do it because I don't think it provides you very useful information. Just like with sulfur, the best diagnostic tool is plant tissue testing. The challenge always with plant tissue testing, and this should always think about with, so I should have mentioned it with sulfur before, is that we're all the way into the season. You can't really use that as a predictive tool. We can use it to monitor things over time so that at least we know for next year, if we ran short this year, odds are pretty good we're also going to run short next year. But coming into a new soil or a new situation, not always going to give you the information and time to act. With boron, we've kind of recognized that. I think as far back as anybody can remember, at least that I've asked, at every institution I've been part of, we recommend boron prophylactically on any of those crops that are especially sensitive. Alfalfa, we're always going to recommend 3 to 4 pounds per acre per year, no matter what. We do the same thing with the coal crops. Even alfalfa or asparagus, we'll recommend a couple pounds every few years, just to make sure that we don't run short. And I think that you'll find that, with most labs, they'll almost always include a boron recommendation. If you're growing alfalfa, we're going to recommend some boron, even if the soil test suggests you're, in a sufficient range. Just want to make sure. For fertilizers, we've got a lot of different options. The most common, the sodium tetraborate. Of course, we've got borax and solubor. Applications or placement. In general, banding's definitely not recommended. Pretty significant risk of seedling injury. The easiest way to put it out is with a broadcast and a blended fertilizer, so you can get a nice uniform application. We can also put it out as a foliar with taking care not to exceed 1/2 to 1 pound per acre in any given application, and put it out with plenty of water so that we don't risk too much burn. And the thing with boron especially, but really all of the micronutrients, is that the range between deficiency and toxicity is relatively narrow. There's not a lot of slop in between. So with that, it's really important that we get nice uniform applications, which is why I think it's best applied with a blended fertilizer where we can broadcast, and much easier to broadcast 500 pounds per acre than it is 1 pound per acre. All right, and finally, we're coming back around to talk a little bit about manganese. Again, the high-level stuff absorbed as the manganese cation is a metal, a +2 cation. Average concentration in plant tissue is 50 parts per million. Second only to, among the micronutrients, second only to iron. Iron runs somewhere around 100 part per million. Involved in a number of enzyme reactions. The key here and sort of clue is that, it's an enzyme. So with enzymes, it acts as the catalyst. It's used over and over again, which is why the plants don't need much of it. It's not like nitrogen or phosphorus that's actually used to build plant parts and structures within the plant. This can be used over and over again. With those enzymes, they're responsible for chlorophyll production, metabolism and energy transfer, as well as growth regulation. So again, with that, its role in chlorophyll, deficiency symptoms are going to show up as an overall pale green color. In corn, it also shows up as this sort of green striping. This actually looks a lot like magnesium deficiency, and I can't distinguish the two. Both of them are immobile nutrients, and which means that your deficiency symptoms are going to show up in the new growth first. In soybean, I think it's a lot easier to spot in soybean. You get that interveinal chlorosis, the veins stay deep dark green. You've got that yellowing in between. And so far as I know, manganese deficiency in soybean is probably the most common in our region. But I was talking to Amy and Jared, there he is in the back, earlier, and they were talking about actually seeing a lot more manganese deficiency in barley, which kind of surprised me. I wasn't aware. Conditions for deficiency, generally a higher pH, persistently wet soils, so really poorly drained soils, sandy, low organic matter, and again with those muck soils. And crops really, again, differ in their sensitivity to manganese. And I just want to point out kind of an interesting thing, an anomaly, and when we look at these, soybean shows up under highly sensitive, moderately sensitive, and low sensitive. And so this is out of the soil fertility text that I used back in the 90s. And I spotted that back in the 90s and looked for an explanation in the text, and there really isn't one. I finally just kind of came around to this, and it was actually through an unrelated matter. Yeah, I'm sure you guys, this has been discussed here before. When Roundup Ready became pretty much the standby early on, we heard a lot of reports of these manganese deficiencies showing up in soybeans everywhere. And it caused a big stir, and the research community jumped. There was funding to be had, is what it means. And they basically went out and it's kind of a nice trial. You can go out and start looking at manganese deficiencies in all of our variety trials, our state level variety trials, looking at tissue samples, and we can also split those plots with and without manganese, look at manganese in the soils. You can measure all sorts of things out there. And what they ended up finding, and several folks found this, especially up in the north central region, is that there is as much variability and sensitivity to manganese deficiency within Roundup Ready varieties as there are within conventional varieties as there are across all of them. So what happened is, they all sort of traced this back. A lot of these early, the early varieties that they were selecting for Roundup Ready resistance, they just got unlucky and happened to choose some that were more sensitive to boron deficiency. Along with that work, there was a bunch of concern that there's potential interaction between actual glyphosate and manganese nutrition in soybeans, and part of that came out of these anecdotal observations that after you apply Roundup, certain varieties of beans, they show pretty strong injury right after. It's the way they metabolize it. You see that in the new growth, and it looks an awful lot like manganese deficiency. Well, that took a little bit more effort, but I think the jury's pretty much decided that it's not a manganese interaction. It's just showing glyphosate injury. So I think we can kind of put that one to bed. In terms of diagnosing manganese, the malic 3, our most common routine soil fertility extract, actually is a valid measure of it. It works really well. The challenge for most of us is that we don't have a lot of calibration data. We just don't have enough manganese deficient sites. We've been able to develop a nice relationship between soil test level and response to manganese. And the places where they do, and Delaware is one, it does appear that including pH, a measure of pH with it does improve the interpretation, or at least its ability to predict a manganese deficiency. And again, plant tissue analysis is the best tool. We go straight to 4?
Yep.
Good. Lots of options for fertilizers. Manganese sulfate's probably the most common. We can also use the oxide form. The critical thing with the oxide form is that it needs to be micronized. It needs to be really finely powdered. It's totally not insoluble, so we've got to increase the surface area where we can get some of it to dissolve. The chelated forms, generally no more effective than the sulfate forms, but does potentially offer some additional options we'll talk about in a second. And again, manure, like most micronutrients, manure is a really good source. When we look at rates, 3/4 of a pound to 30 pounds. It depends on, of course, the need, also the placement and the form that we're putting it out. So just a brief summary. I know there's a lot of information there. I basically distilled this down from about 4 extension publications from all the way down North Carolina all the way north to Pennsylvania. Generally, when you look at the broadcast applications, everybody's in agreement. It's probably not practical, just because of the rates that you'd have to put it out. But the other is that whatever conditions there that's limiting manganese solubility of the existing soil manganese is going to do the same thing to your fertilizer manganese. So really high rates, and the effects are really short-lived. In situations where that's the only option you've got for whatever reason, it's critical that it be applied right before planting so that we maximize the time period where we've got available manganese to the crop. Most folks agree that banding is a good option where you can make the logistics work for it. I started poking around in the literature a couple weeks ago and found there was some work done up in Michigan. They've got a lot of problems with manganese deficiency. And one of the things they came across is when they were comparing starters with and without manganese, when they used the starters that also were acidifying starters, ammonium sulfate or ammonium polyphosphate, they actually found that they were able to eliminate manganese deficiencies in corn, and they also showed it in soybean, whether they had the manganese fertilizer in there or not, just because of the acidifying effect right there close to the roots, made the manganese that was there available that wasn't before. So something to consider, and potentially a reason why we don't see a lot of manganese deficiency in corn in our region. And that may change as we start to see more and more corn go out without that 2x2 next to it. And then finally, foliar applications is probably the best option. We've got really high soil pH that is going to limit the solubility or availability of any manganese that was soil applied, whether it's at broadcast or in a 2x2. The one thing I said I was going to mention this, when we're putting it out with glyphosate, we got to recognize that there's an antagonism with manganese and glyphosate. It'll reduce its effectiveness. And generally what most folks agree is if we use an EDTA form of manganese and put some ammonium sulfate on top of that, the antagonism seems to not be an issue. Always read your labels. Finally, coming around to zinc. Like manganese, taken up by the plant as a +2 cation. Lower concentration than manganese, more similar to what we see for boron. Like manganese, responsible or involved in a number of enzymatic processes. chlorophyll production, and carbohydrate formation. So the chlorophyll production, obviously, that one's going to be important for diagnosing deficiencies. The carbohydrate formation, and this is one that has been coming up more and more in conversations that I've had with colleagues in the north central region, where we're really pushing these high yields. Do we need to up the zinc? Do we need to reevaluate, the crop needs for zinc? And there's a lot of work coming down the pike that I think we'll see in the next several years, where we're looking at, basically zinc requirements across different yield environments and with different amounts of nitrogen. As we're starting to push up, and see 300 plus bushel corn under irrigated environments, kind of like what we can do. Do we need to increase our zinc? Jury's still out. I'm skeptical, but we'll see. Deficiency symptoms. This one's pretty easy to spot. You end up with this white-yellow scalding, especially in young corn plants. You'll also see the striping show up, again, similar to manganese and magnesium. Hard to distinguish between those. Again, an immobile nutrient. So you're going to see deficiencies first in the new growth. I've pretty much come to accept this one. Deficiencies are really not that common in our region. I talked to Doug Beagle about this when I first got to Penn State about 5 years ago. Pretty early in Doug's career, he tripped across this field, which is about 30 minutes from University Park, and a farmer's field that we've worked with a bunch ever since, and got really excited. This is anytime a soil fertility specialist comes into something like this, this can make your career. I'm gonna calibrate, a soil test for zinc, which nobody else has been able to do. He went out to this field and 69 others over the next 3 or 4 years. The deficiency symptom in this field disappeared. Never saw them again. And in those 69 others, we never saw a significant response to applied zinc. So pretty hard to calibrate a soil test if you don't have any responsive sites. So again, I think that you got to have the conditions there, and we know pretty well what those are. Sandy soils, low organic matter, really high pH, no recent manure applications, cool, wet soil conditions, and that's really what was going on with this deficiency. He had a pH just in this corner of the field that was up around 7.3, probably where the lime was stockpiled before it was land applied, and it was a cool, wet spring. Kind of, set up the perfect storm to see zinc deficiency, and it only ever occurred in that season. Of course, crops differ in their sensitivity to zinc. I think in our region, corn's the one we see most often. Like manganese, Mehlich-3 is a great measure of zinc. The problem is we don't really have it well calibrated because we don't have responsive sites. And places where they do, including in Virginia, what they found is that if you look at extractable zinc, extractable phosphorus, and extractable pH, they can come up with this multivariate model that comes pretty close to predicting where you might or might not have a zinc deficiency. I guess I would argue that you can probably do that just by looking at pH and, is it a sandy soil or a clayey soil, and have you seen zinc deficiencies there before?
And a high phosphorus level.
And the next thing is where we do see those show up are those really high phosphorus soils.
I saw a field probably 25 years ago where for 50 years they put a ton of 10, 10, 10 on the field. The pH was 6.8, and the zinc level where they burnt the plastic piles was 40 pounds to the acre.
Oof.
And the normal level in the field was 10, but where they burned the plastic piles, crop was normal. So once they reduced the phosphorus level, where they went from 200 pounds to the acre to 25 pounds the acre,
yeah.
It cleared up the problem.
You guys hear all that? So it was basically a situation where they created an antagonism from excessive phosphorus. Yeah. And the important thing that Doug always points out is with the high phosphorus, it's from fertilizer, not from manure. If we have the high phosphorus from manure, what else do you get? Lots of zinc. I guess the other way to do that is burn your plastic. Yeah. In terms of managing zinc, we've got basically the option between zinc sulfate and chelated zinc. There are a couple of others. The nice thing with zinc is we've got more options for application. Banded, broadcast banded seed placement and foliar. Of course, anytime we go to those seed placement or foliar, it's really important that we start looking at lowering our rates to reduce seedling injury or burning. And again, just like with manganese, where we've got a situation where we've got bad zinc deficiencies because we know the soil pH is really high, foliar is probably our best option. The other thing to point out is that with our broadcast rates, even with our banded, if we're going with these higher rates, it's usually what folks have found is that usually takes care of your zinc needs for at least the next 3 to 5 years. It's not something that we have to do every year. Of course, when we're looking at seed placement or foliar with such a low rate, that's something that needs to be done at least every year. All right, so I just want to drive this point home. Because micronutrient deficiencies are pretty rare in the mid-Atlantic and especially up in the Northeast, we don't have a lot of good calibration. You've got to have responsive sites in order to determine what that critical level would be. And I just made up those points just to illustrate this. So without having responsive sites, we can't define what that critical soil test level is. So even in situations where we know we've got a good measure like the Malic 3, if we can't define what a low value is on that Malic 3 where we would see a response, there's no way to interpret it. So the question then is, so does soil testing have any value whatsoever for micronutrient management in our region?
The pH value is probably the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, of the $9 we charge for a soil test, I would say that $7.50 of that value is in your measure of pH because it drives everything. It drives everything. So, with that routine soil test, you can determine, are the conditions right? Do we have high pH? Do we have excessive phosphorus? Is organic matter low? We can also, most of us are now measuring and reporting micronutrients. In Pennsylvania, we've been doing this going back for almost 20 years. We don't have an interpretation or recommendation that goes with that, but we do have, we report what everybody else gets. What's the normal range? And if I tell you that micronutrient deficiencies are rare in our region and you're running down on the very low end of the spectrum, maybe those are the fields that we take a closer look at and go in and do some additional testing, like plant tissue analysis. And again, too often we use plant tissue analysis as a tool to go in and reaffirm visual deficiency symptoms that we might see there, rather than using it as a routine monitoring tool. And I think that we've really underutilized plant tissue analysis. This is the kind of situation where we ought to be able to get in and pick up and detect asymptomatic deficiencies that are down in that what we call the hidden hunger, that may be giving us a yield lag, but maybe not showing up these gross easily identified visual deficiencies. And I think I'm going to leave it there with some time for questions, Nicole says. Yeah.
The plant tissue analysis, along with the soil sample, is very important for fruit crops and small fruit crops, because basically, if you know the pH and you know what's going in on the crop as far as the foliar stuff, you can adjust for that crop.
You guys hear that? Bob's just pointing out the special importance of using tissue analysis and fruit, perennial crops especially.
Small fruit,
yep.
fruit.
And in those situations, the other is we've done a lot more research in those crops using tissue analysis, because you're dealing with a perennial. Soil testing is useful for kind of evaluating pH and relative nutrient availability, but really fine-tuning things with a high-value crop like that requires tissue analysis. I think in agronomic crops, especially when we're starting to look at things like sulfur and the micronutrients, you look at the cost of most of your micronutrient packages versus the cost of a plant tissue. I mean, we charge $24 for just a routine plant tissue. So spread that over, say 10 acres just to monitor things. That's pretty inexpensive, particularly compared to the cost of most of your micronutrient packages. Without that measurement, I mean, it's somewhat prophylactic. You're just putting insurance out, which is all right. And I buy insurance. It's just important to recognize that that's what you're doing. And I think that's the critical thing.
So, John, would you say that's you compare that approach with boron as well, or do you think boron is a better bet?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Tom. So I was riding down the road with Doug Beagle pretty soon after I started at Penn State. I think we were coming to this meeting. And I asked him how frequently he'd seen boron deficiency. And I think I told you, I've seen it 3 or 4 times, and it's been usually drought, or it was probably actually leafhopper damage and not boron deficiency. And he said he's hardly ever seen it either, but as long as he can remember, we've always applied boron to alfalfa. So, was that U.S. borax just, sold us all that we absolutely had to apply boron everywhere? The hot water extractable boron and most of the boron recommendations that we still have today, you can trace all the way back to, I can't remember his name, but he was with U.S. Borax. They provided a lot of really good money for research. But the folks that have done that have all retired and moved on. So I don't know.
The biggest thing with boron is the crop.
Yes.
I've seen it in
Yeah.
broccoli, cauliflower, and beets.
Yeah.
And you can look at the soil test and say, well, I shouldn't have had it,
Right.
but I've seen it there.
Yeah.
So,
And that's, to your point, a really high value crop. The vegetables that have a high demand, I think it's good insurance. I don't know on alfalfa. I have no idea. I've never seen an alfalfa crop that didn't already have boron on it. 3 pounds to the acre. Yeah.
On fruit, it's one of the micronutrients that'll show up more often than the other ones.
Yes.
On fruits.
Yeah. Apples especially.
But
Yeah.
yes, and in the tissue analysis.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
I mean, it's out there, but there are often other reasons for that.
Right. Yeah, I agree.